The sea had teeth that night, bared in a kuei feng, each swell a ravenous jaw snapping at the frail hull of the fishing boat. Elias, his face a roadmap of salt and time, squinted against the deluge. 20 years he'd watched the ocean's moods, but this felt different, malevolent somehow, personal. The beam from the lighthouse, usually a comforting scythe through the darkness, seemed diminished, swallowed by the storm's insatiable hunger. Then he saw her. A broken doll tossed on the waves, clinging to splintered wood. A silhouette against the furious white, a desperate spark in the all-consuming dark. He knew, instantly, he had to try. He wrestled the small boat, a dance of desperation against the ocean's fury. Each lurch, a reminder of what he'd lost to these same waters. Each crash of the waves, a whispered accusation. He pulled her aboard, a fragile bird plucked from the storm's maw. Shivering, unconscious, clutching something tight against her chest. A glint of silver in the dim light. He recognized it even before he gently pried her fingers loose. The locket, tarnished, seawater stained, but unmistakable. Identical to the one that had been lost that night, 20 years ago. The night the North Star went down. The night his life fractured. The same locket. A cold dread coiled in his gut, a serpent awakening from a long, uneasy slumber. It couldn't be. Too much time had passed. Too much pain had been buried beneath the gray monotony of his solitary life. The ocean was playing tricks, cruel, watery illusions born of grief and guilt. He carried her inside, the lighthouse looming above, a silent sentinel guarding secrets best left undisturbed. He laid her on his cot, the only soft place in his Spartan existence. As he tended to her, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a rescue. It was an unraveling. The storm raged on, mirroring the tempest brewing within him. He banked the fire, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Shadows that seemed to writhe and twist, whispering forgotten names, replaying scenes he desperately tried to forget. He remembered her then, his Mary, her laughter like the chime of distant bells, her eyes the color of the summer sky, the way she used to hum as she polished the very same locket, a gift from her mother, a family heirloom. He closed his eyes, the memory a sharp, stabbing pain, the memory of her face, pale and drawn, as she stood on the shore that night, listening to the screams carried on the wind, the screams of the drowning, the screams that never truly stopped echoing in his mind. Mary never recovered. The horror of that night consumed her, a slow, insidious poison. She faded away, like a ship disappearing over the horizon, leaving him alone with his guilt and the relentless sea. He'd sought solace in the solitude of the lighthouse, hoping to outrun the ghosts of the past. He threw himself into the routine, the endless cycle of oiling gears and polishing lenses, a desperate attempt to find order in the chaos that raged within. He buried the memories deep, sealing them away in the darkest corners of his heart. But the sea remembers. The sea never forgets. And then he heard it. A low, mournful groan carried on the wind. A sound that chilled him to the bone. A sound he hadn't heard in 2 decades. A foghorn. But not the lighthouse's horn. The lighthouse horn was a steady, reassuring bellow, a beacon of hope in the darkness. This was different. This was guttural, primal, a sound of immense suffering rising from the depths. It wasn't the lighthouse's own. It was the foghorn from the North Star, a ghost ship's lament rising from its watery grave, or so it seemed to his fevered mind. He stared out into the raging storm, the locket heavy in his hand, the woman sleeping soundly, unaware of the memories she'd stirred, the secrets she threatened to unearth. He knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in his soul, that the past had come back to claim him. He listened to the moaning wind, the crashing waves, and the mournful cry of the phantom foghorn, a symphony of dread that heralded the dawn of a reckoning he had desperately tried to avoid. And he knew, with a growing sense of impending doom, that the silence he had so carefully cultivated was about to be broken. The ocean was revealing its secrets, and it was just getting started. He woke to the rhythm of the waves, a ceaseless percussion against the stone. Another day claimed by the sea, another sunrise painting the same unforgiving landscape. Each morning began the same, a ritual etched into the very bones of the island, a methodical dance against the encroaching silence. The lamp needed tending, the log needed entries, the soul needed nothing. He needed nothing. He told himself that. But the truth, like the insidious tide, crept in around the edges. The clank of metal on metal as he adjusted the great lens echoed in the cavernous space, bouncing back as a hollow mockery of purpose. He moved with a practiced grace, the movements of a man long wedded to routine, but his eyes held a distant flicker, a haunted ember refusing to be extinguished. The light swept across the churning water, a lifeline cast into the void. He imagined it reaching out, a beacon of hope for sailors lost in the tempest. But what hope did it offer him? He was tethered to this lonely rock, a prisoner of his own making. The wind howled, a mournful dirge that spoke of shipwrecks and sorrow, a constant reminder of what he had lost, of what he had, perhaps, caused. A younger face flashed in his mind, a vibrant smile, eyes that held the warmth of a summer sky. Her laughter, like wind chimes in the garden, now a distant, aching memory. They had walked these cliffs hand in hand, dreamed beneath the watchful gaze of the lighthouse, before the storm, before the screams. He remembered the strength in her hands when he first met her, how they squeezed his while he recovered from a small injury he'd sustained at sea. How she used to say it was like holding the earth in his hands, so strong and full of life. He recalled how she would sing as he worked, simple melodies that filled their small cottage with joy. The memory shifted, fracturing into shards of jagged pain. The storm-lashed shore, the relentless waves clawing at the land. The desperate cries carried on the wind, a chorus of terror that ripped through the night. He had been there, pulling bodies from the wreckage, fighting against the unforgiving sea. He had been a hero, they said, but he had failed. He saw her face, pale and drawn after that night. The light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a shadow that mirrored the darkness in his own soul. The screams had followed her, invaded her dreams, poisoned her waking hours. The sea had taken more than just lives that night. It had stolen her peace, her joy, her very essence. He replayed the scene in his mind, a film reel stuck on repeat. His youthful exuberance as he ran down the beach, the adrenaline pumping in his veins. But now he looks back at it with the jaded eyes of a man who knows that he was too late. She had wasted away, slowly, inexorably, until only a shell remained. And then she was gone, taken by the sea as surely as any sailor lost in the storm. The doctor had called it pneumonia, a complication from exposure, but he knew the truth. She had died of a broken heart, a heart shattered by the screams that echoed in the silence of their home. He retreated further into himself, into the mechanical routine of the lighthouse keeper. He built walls of solitude, brick by brick, sealing himself off from the world, from the pain. He avoided the mainland, shunned human contact. The only voices he heard were the gulls crying overhead and the relentless roar of the ocean. He convinced himself that he preferred it that way, that he was safer alone, that they were safer alone. He continued with his routine, ensuring everything was in its right place. The bed was neatly made, the table wiped clean, the bookshelf was alphabetized, everything as it should be. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, seeing the wrinkles on his face, the gray hairs, the sorrow in his eyes. He glanced at the old, worn photograph on the mantel, a younger version of himself beaming with happiness beside his wife. He quickly averted his gaze, the pain too sharp, too raw. It was a ghost that haunted every corner of his existence, a constant reminder of the life he had lost, the happiness he had destroyed. He was a lighthouse keeper, a solitary sentinel against the encroaching darkness. But in the deepest recesses of his heart, he knew he was also a prisoner, trapped within the walls of his own guilt, forever haunted by the screams of the drowned. He did not dare venture into his mind for too long. He feared the consequences. His memories were as dangerous as the sea, always ready to engulf him. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. Another day gone, another day closer to what? He didn't know. He didn't want to know. He only knew that the silence was growing louder, the shadows growing longer, and the whispers of the past were beginning to stir. And he thought he could hear the faintest sound of a child's laughter on the wind, beckoning him toward the rocks. The sea, it gives and it takes, and sometimes it returns what we thought was lost forever, a cruel jest played by the tide. Isla spoke of jagged metal teeth tearing at the hull, of shadowed figures suspended in the icy black, of a captain's wheel still clutched by skeletal hands. Words that were echoes, phantom pains in a forgotten wound. Each detail, a shard of glass twisting in my gut. The sea serpent, they called her, bound for Glasgow, swallowed whole by a storm 20 years gone. 20 years I'd spent silencing the ghosts, bricking them up in the deepest chambers of my heart. And now, this girl, this innocent stranger, was dismantling the walls stone by agonizing stone. Her locket, identical to the one, no, it couldn't be. A trick of the light, a cruel coincidence. But the tremor in my hands, the sudden sickening lurch in my stomach, betrayed the lie. Memories, like shards of ice, began to prick at the edges of my mind. Faces of the drowned, their silent screams echoing in the roar of the waves. The lighthouse, my sanctuary, my prison, seemed to shudder with a newfound unease. A flicker in the lamp, a stutter in its rhythmic pulse, like a heart skipping a beat. The old generator sputtered and coughed, throwing grotesque shadows that danced with the encroaching darkness. It wasn't just the storm brewing outside. Something was stirring within these walls, something long dormant, now clawing its way back to the surface. The rational part of me, the Elias who clung to routine and reason, tried to dismiss it all. Old wires, salt-corroded connections, the wear and tear of decades battling the elements. But the growing unease was like a rising tide, flooding the carefully constructed dam of my denial. The air itself seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken truths. And then came the sound, not the comforting groan of the foghorn, a familiar lullaby in the symphony of the sea. This was different, a mournful, drawn-out wail, like the keening of a lost soul, carried on the wind, a sound that burrowed deep into the marrow of my bones. a sound that resonated with the buried sorrow I thought I had long conquered. Isla, bless her naive heart, heard nothing at first, but I saw the subtle shift in her expression, the almost imperceptible furrowing of her brow as the sound intensified. She felt it, even if she couldn't name it. The island was waking, remembering, and it was calling out for justice, for absolution. Sleep offered no escape. The faces of the drowned swirled in the darkness behind my eyelids, their accusing eyes burning into my soul. Margaret's face, her smile frozen in time, haunted me the most. Her last words, a whispered promise to return before the storm broke, echoed endlessly in the chambers of my mind. Each day, the electrical anomalies grew more frequent, more violent. Lights flickering, compasses spinning wildly, the radio crackling with static, voices lost in the white noise. The lighthouse, once a beacon of hope, was becoming a conduit for something dark and malevolent. I tried to focus on the task at hand, on the endless cycle of maintenance and observation, but the rhythmic sweep of the lamp felt more like a spotlight, exposing my guilt, my complicity. The sea, once my solace, now seemed to mock me with its relentless rhythm, its endless capacity to swallow and conceal. Isla, unknowingly, continued to probe, to question. She spoke of currents and tides, of the ship's manifest, of the lives lost that night, each word a twist of the knife. I found myself retreating further into myself, building walls of silence to protect the crumbling foundations of my sanity. I saw the questions forming in her eyes, the growing suspicion that something wasn't right. She sensed the undercurrent of secrets, the unspoken grief that permeated every corner of the lighthouse. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the truth, like a relentless wave, was about to break. The fog rolled in thicker than ever before, shrouding the island in an impenetrable veil. The mournful sound intensified, resonating through the very stone of the lighthouse. It was a sound of mourning, of accusation, of impending doom. Isla found an old chart of the coastline, detailing the treacherous reefs and shifting currents. She traced the route of the sea serpent, her finger stopping at a point marked with a skull and crossbones. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I saw a glimmer of understanding, a hint of the truth that was about to unravel. The fog rolled in thicker than ever before, shrouding the island in an impenetrable veil. The mournful sound intensified, resonating through the very stone of the lighthouse. It was a sound of mourning, of accusation, of impending doom. Isla found an old chart of the coastline, detailing the treacherous reefs and shifting currents. She traced the route of the sea serpent, her finger stopping at a point marked with a skull and crossbones. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I saw a glimmer of understanding, a hint of the truth that was about to unravel. She spoke of the storm that night, of the unusually strong winds and the disorienting fog. And then she asked the question I had dreaded for 20 years, the question that threatened to shatter the fragile illusion I had so carefully maintained. She asked about the light, about whether it had been burning bright that night. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the mournful wail of the foghorn and the relentless crashing of the waves against the rocks. The air grew heavy, charged with unspoken truths and the weight of buried sins. The truth hung suspended between us, a fragile, shimmering thing, waiting to be spoken, waiting to be unleashed. And as I stared into her searching eyes, I knew that the reckoning was finally at hand. The sea had given back more than just a locket. It had returned the past, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be forgiven. The silence was about to break, and what lay beneath threatened to drown us both. But before it did, she asked another question, one that echoed in my very soul. Why didn't you save her? The sea, a canvas of perpetual mourning, had begun to reflect a different light. Hope, perhaps, or a cruel imitation of it. The logbooks, their brittle pages whispering tales of a man the island remembered differently, a man who wrestled the storm, a man who offered salvation instead of silence. Elias read them, Isla watched him, and for the first time, the granite of his face seemed to soften, eroded by the faintest glimmer of belief. He began to speak, hesitant at first, like a rusty hinge protesting after years of disuse. Fragments of the past, shards of memory long submerged in the churning ocean of grief. He spoke of his wife, not as a ghost that haunted the shore, but as a woman of laughter and light, a woman who loved the relentless symphony of the waves. He painted pictures with words, vivid and aching, of a life before the storm, a life before the darkness consumed him whole. The lighthouse, a silent sentinel that had witnessed his descent, seemed to hold its breath, listening. The stories were raw, unfinished, punctuated by long silences, filled only with the mournful cry of gulls circling overhead. He spoke of the villagers, of their dependence on the beacon, of the weight of responsibility he carried on his shoulders, a weight that had grown heavier with each passing year. He spoke of that night, the night the sea turned ravenous, the night the sky wept without end. He spoke of the impossible choices, the desperate attempts to save lives, the chilling realization that some were beyond reach. But even in the telling, there was a subtle shift, a recalibration of the narrative. The logbooks had given him permission, perhaps, to see himself as he once was, as the hero the villagers remembered, not the villain his silence had created. Isla listened, her presence a fragile counterpoint to the decades of solitude that had shaped him. She saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the lingering shadow of guilt that still clung to his soul. Was this a genuine breakthrough? A moment of catharsis finally breaking through the hardened layers of denial? Or was it merely a temporary reprieve, a fleeting illusion conjured by the yellowed pages of a forgotten past? The island itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The wind, which had been a constant companion, a relentless tormentor, seemed to soften its howl, as if paying reverence to the fragile hope that had blossomed in the lighthouse's lonely tower. The sun, usually a rare and fleeting visitor, broke through the clouds, casting a golden halo around the aging stone. He showed Isla the small, worn photograph of his wife, tucked away in a hidden compartment of his sea chest. Her eyes, bright and full of life, seemed to pierce through the years, reminding him of the man he once was, the man he had allowed himself to forget. He spoke of her dreams, her ambitions, the future they had planned together before the sea claimed her, along with so many others. He described the locket, identical to the one Isla had found, the one he had given to his wife on their wedding day. He spoke of the intricate engravings, the tiny inscription that read, "Forever yours." He had searched for it relentlessly after the wreck, clinging to the hope that it would somehow lead him back to her, that it would offer him some solace in the face of unimaginable loss. He never found it, until now. The weight of the revelation, of holding the locket once more, however indirectly, seemed to crush him. He retreated back into himself, the light in his eyes dimming, the words drying up in his throat. The island seemed to sense his despair, the wind picking up again, the waves crashing against the rocks with renewed ferocity. Isla tried to reassure him, to remind him of the man the logbooks portrayed, the man who had risked his life to save others. But the truth, she suspected, lay buried deeper than any logbook could reveal. The truth resided in the silence that had consumed him, in the secrets that he had guarded so fiercely for so long. And then, the silence of the foghorn. It stopped. Not a gradual fade, not a stuttering cough, but a sudden, absolute cessation. The rhythmic pulse that had been the island's heartbeat, the mournful cry that had echoed across the waves for decades, was gone. A void, a sudden absence that was more deafening than any storm. The silence descended like a shroud, thick and suffocating. It was a silence that spoke of something broken, something irrevocably changed. It was a silence that amplified the weight of the past, the burden of guilt, the fragility of hope. It was a silence that whispered of the storm yet to come. Elias stared out at the sea, his face pale and drawn. The absence of the foghorn seemed to unnerve him more than any accusation, more than any memory. It was as if the island itself had turned against him, as if the sea had finally claimed its due. Isla felt a chill run down her spine, a sense of foreboding that was more profound than anything she had experienced before. The silence was unnatural, unsettling, a harbinger of something dark and unknown. She looked at Elias, searching for answers in his haunted eyes, but all she saw was fear. The sudden silence was a question mark hanging over the island, over the lighthouse, over the fragile bond that had begun to form between two lost souls. What did it mean? Was it a sign, a warning, or simply a mechanical failure, a cruel trick of fate? But deep down, Isla knew that it was more than that. It was a turning point, a prelude to something significant, something that would either shatter the last vestiges of Elias's denial or plunge him even deeper into the abyss. The foghorn had stopped, but the storm within him had just begun to gather strength. And somewhere, hidden within the labyrinth of his memories, lay the truth, waiting to be unleashed. And what was the truth, Isla wondered, if not the most deafening sound of all? It was a question she suddenly desperately needed to know the answer to. The only answer. But how much would be destroyed when it finally broke free? The light, his light, the one he swore to protect, flickered only in the carefully crafted pages of a lie. Years of meticulous maintenance, a life dedicated to the illusion of service, and beneath it all, a vault of deceit. The journals spoke with a clarity the man himself had long abandoned, each entry a calculated step away from the precipice of truth. It wasn't storm damage nor faulty equipment, but a simple, devastating human error, masked by desperation. His hand, the one that steadied the lamp for decades, had betrayed its purpose. Sleep, exhaustion, the relentless pounding of the waves, a perfect storm of negligence, and in its wake, a sea choked with lives. The truth was a cold, sharp shard, piercing the fog of his self-deception. He saw it now, not as a hero battling the elements, but as the architect of tragedy. Each fabricated log entry, each feigned moment of mourning, a fresh layer of guilt cemented upon his soul. The weight of those lives, the screams swallowed by the storm, had not been silenced, but amplified, echoing in the hollow chambers of his heart. He had built a fortress of denial, brick by painstaking brick, only to find himself imprisoned within its walls. And the locket, the tarnished silver, clutched by the young woman, wasn't a relic of the storm, but a shard of his own shattered past. It was his wife's, a keepsake he'd sworn to protect, a promise broken along with so many others. He had kept it, hidden away, a tangible reminder of all he had lost, all he had failed to save. His wife, claimed by the same sea that now threatened to consume him whole. He had carried her memory like a phantom limb, a constant ache, a silent accusation. The locket was never lost at sea. It had been with him all along, his silent companion, his constant reminder. The journal spoke of a man consumed by guilt, driven to the brink by grief and exhaustion. A man who made a choice, a fatal error, and then chose to bury it, to rewrite history in his own image. A man who sacrificed truth for the sake of his own fragile sanity. The lighthouse, once a beacon of hope, had become a monument to his shame. The fog rolled in, thick and heavy, mirroring the turmoil within him. The beam, his life's work, his burden, sliced through the swirling mist, a futile attempt to penetrate the darkness he had invited in. It felt like his soul was an oil-soaked rag left out in the rain, slowly unraveling. He'd built a life around a lie, a fragile construct that was now crumbling around him. He had believed, perhaps desperately, that he could outrun the past, that the sea would eventually relinquish its secrets. But the sea remembers, and it always, always returns what is owed. Isla, a mirror reflecting the man he once was, the man he could never be again. Her presence, once a flicker of hope in his desolate existence, now felt like a burning brand upon his skin. He had sought solace in her youth, in her unwavering spirit, hoping to absorb some of her light. But she had unearthed the darkness, shattered the illusion, and left him exposed to the chilling reality of his deeds. The truth was a relentless tide, pulling him under, dragging him back to that fateful night. The cries of the drowning, the splintering of wood, the deafening roar of the storm, all replaying in vivid detail, a torment from which there was no escape. It was the soundtrack to his waking hours, the background music to his life. He had tried to silence it, to drown it out with routine and denial, but the sea held no mercy. He remembered the frantic scramble, the desperate attempts to reach the sinking vessel, the faces of those he couldn't save, etched forever in his memory. The crushing weight of failure, the knowledge that he could have done more. He thought he saw his wife in the faces of the dying that night, but no amount of imagined redemption could wash away the stain. The weight of his silence pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of regret. He had become a prisoner of his own making, trapped within the confines of the lighthouse, a solitary sentinel, guarding a secret that threatened to consume him. The foghorn moaned, a mournful cry echoing across the water. It was a sound he had grown accustomed to, a constant reminder of the sea's power, its indifference. But tonight, it sounded different, more visceral, more haunting, almost accusatory, almost as if the sea itself was speaking, calling him to account. He had tried to bury the truth, to silence the voices, but they had only grown louder, more insistent. He had built a lighthouse of lies, but its foundations were built on sand. And now the storm was coming, threatening to wash it all away. He looked out at the churning sea, at the relentless waves crashing against the rocks. It was a mirror of his own inner turmoil, a reflection of the chaos that raged within him. He felt a strange sense of calm amidst the storm, a sense of resignation. Perhaps this was his fate, to be consumed by the sea, to become one with the tragedy he had caused. He thought of his wife, of her gentle smile, her unwavering love. He imagined her waiting for him on the other side, in a place where there was no pain, no guilt, no secrets. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he felt a sense of peace. But the peace was fleeting. The truth lingered, a festering wound that refused to heal. He knew that he could not escape his past, that he could not outrun the consequences of his actions. He had to face it, to confront the darkness within him, or be forever consumed by it. The light of the lighthouse, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a spotlight, exposing his shame to the world. He wondered if he could ever find redemption, if he could ever forgive himself, or if he was destined to remain a prisoner of his own making, forever haunted by the ghosts of the past. But now that the truth was exposed, like a wound finally opened to the air, a new question arose, chilling him to the very bone. What would he do now? The journals lay open, an indictment etched in faded ink, decades of careful lies now crumbling to dust. The hero, the grieving widower, the steadfast keeper of the light, all a phantom born of desperate self-preservation. He stares, not at Isla, not at the damning words, but into the abyss of his own making. A hollowness spreads within him, wider than the storm-lashed sea, deeper than any ocean trench. His eyes glaze over, the present receding like a tide pulled by a malevolent moon. The cottage fades, the accusing silence of Isla diminishes, replaced by the thunderous roar of wind and water. He's no longer in the room, but swallowed whole by a memory, a moment eternally suspended in the amber of his guilt. It's the night again, 20 years peeled away like barnacles from a hull. The wind, a banshee wailing at the tower. The frantic dance of the waves, clawing at the island's edge. The lamp, his responsibility, his sacred duty, flickering, faltering. Then, nothing. He sees himself, a younger, frazzled version, battling the relentless storm, the ceaseless demands of the machinery. Exhaustion, a venomous serpent coiling around his mind. The endless night blurring into a single, agonizing point. A moment flaps, a fatal error, born not of malice, but of the crushing weight of circumstance. A moment he'd replay endlessly in the theater of his mind. Then darkness, not the gentle cloak of sleep, but the suffocating black of utter catastrophe. The sickening crunch of metal against rock, the screams swallowed by the storm, the agonizing realization dawning with the grim light of dawn. He sees the faces of the lost, their spectral eyes accusing, their silent pleas echoing in the chambers of his heart. The fishermen who sang sea shanties, the young couple eloping to a new life, the mother clutching her child, all extinguished, all because of him. And then the rationalizations began, the insidious whispers of self-preservation. A moment's error doesn't define a life, he told himself. The logs can be altered, the truth can be buried beneath layers of carefully constructed narrative. He could be the hero they needed. He could be the island's protector, a vigil kept in penance. A lie he could tell himself to keep himself safe. He feels the phantom weight of his wife's hand in his, cold and still. Her last words lost forever to the storm of his making. Her face superimposed on every wave, every gust of wind. Her love turned to a haunting lament that only he can hear. Back in the cottage, his body is a shell, the vibrant blue of his eyes now clouded and opaque. He is unreachable, lost in the maelstrom of his past. His hands tremble, mimicking the chaotic movements of the waves, the desperate flailing of those lost souls. Isla watches, her heart a battleground. The man she saw, the stoic keeper of the light, has vanished, replaced by a broken specter consumed by a guilt too immense to bear. The anger that flared within her at the deception now flickers, replaced by a chilling wave of pity. How could anyone live with such a burden? How could he construct such an elaborate prison of lies, only to condemn himself to a lifetime of solitary confinement? She wants to shake him, to demand answers, to force him to acknowledge the pain he inflicted. But the words die in her throat, choked by the raw grief that emanates from him like a palpable fog. The lighthouse groans, the ancient stones vibrating with an unnatural energy. The electrical system spasm, lights flickering wildly, plunging the room into stark relief and oppressive darkness. The air crackles with an unseen force, a manifestation of the turmoil within. And then it returns, the foghorn, not the deep, resonant bellow of a navigational aid, but a tortured, drawn-out moan, a primal scream ripped from the depths of his soul. It's louder now, more insistent, no longer a warning to ships at sea, but a lament for a life irrevocably lost, a constant echo of his inner torment. The sound claws at Isla's eardrums, a sonic assault that mirrors the unraveling of everything she thought she knew. She covers her ears, but the sound is inside her now, resonating with the horror of the revelation, the profound tragedy of Elias's broken existence. She reaches out hesitantly to touch his arm, a gesture of compassion, a desperate attempt to anchor him to the present. But he remains unresponsive, a ship adrift on a sea of regret. The foghorn wails, a relentless dirge that fills the cottage, the island, the very air itself. The room is filled with shadows and the weight of unspoken truths. Isla stares at the broken man before her, caught between the impulse to condemn and the overwhelming urge to offer solace. The boundaries between justice and mercy blur, lost in the storm of his guilt. He stares directly forward, looking at and seeing nothing. The locket his wife used to wear lies on the table nearby, reflecting the fractured light. What unforgivable sins are yet to emerge from the depths of his buried past? The storm raged, a mirror to the tempest inside him. 20 years of silence, 20 years of meticulously constructed lies, all threatened to collapse with every crashing wave. The truth, a cold, sharp shard of glass, was now exposed, cutting deeper with each agonizing breath. Isla, a beacon of unwanted light, tried to pull him back from the precipice, from the churning abyss that promised oblivion. But the sea called to him, a siren song of guilt and despair. He saw their faces in the foam, the lost souls swallowed by his mistake, by his one moment of weakness that stretched into an eternity of regret. His wife's face, too, pale and drawn, forever haunted by the echo of their screams. He deserved to join them, to be dragged down into the cold, unforgiving depths. The locket, cold against his skin, was a tangible link to a life that could have been, a life stolen by his actions. He clutched it, the weight a crushing reminder of everything he had lost, everything he had destroyed. Isla's words, desperate pleas for him to choose life, were muffled by the roaring wind and the pounding surf. Could he ever be free of this self-made prison? Could absolution ever reach one so burdened by the past? Then, a surge of raw emotion, a primal scream ripped from the depths of his soul. He opened his hand. The locket, a silver tear, plunged into the maelstrom. It was gone. A final goodbye, a letting go. But what would he do now? The storm began to relent, the fury slowly dissipating, mirroring the shift within him. Dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fragile gold. The sea, exhausted, stilled into an uneasy calm. On the horizon, a vessel approached, its form growing larger against the pale light. The island no longer felt like a refuge, but like a cage. The authorities had come. He walked away from the lighthouse, the only home he had known for so long, the stage for his slow unraveling. He carried no belongings, only the echoes of the past and the burden of the truth, now finally acknowledged. He stole one last glance back at the towering structure, its white paint gleaming in the morning sun. It stood resolute, a stoic sentinel against the vast expanse of the sea. The guilt remained, a dull ache in his chest, but something else flickered there too, a fragile ember of something akin to peace. The lighthouse lamp, now shining clearly in the distance, was a beacon to others, not himself. And then, the final act. Isla, her figure silhouetted against the dawn, stood at the top of the lighthouse, her gaze steady, unwavering. She raised her hand, a silent farewell. She was the new keeper now, guardian of the secrets, protector of the light. The island had claimed her, just as it had once claimed him. She was forever bound to this lonely rock, forever intertwined with his story, his guilt, his pain. He stepped onto the boat, leaving the island behind, receding into the distance. Where would he go? Could he ever truly escape the shadows of his past? Could he ever learn to forgive himself? The lighthouse beam, a steadfast promise against the encroaching darkness, cut through the sky, a silent sentinel. It was a promise of safety, but also a stark reminder of the tragedy that had transpired under its unwavering watch. The island held its breath, waiting, watching. He looked back one last time, the island a fading silhouette against the horizon. The gulls cried overhead, their mournful calls echoing his own unspoken grief. He was adrift, lost at sea, the horizon the only thing he could see. He had traded one prison for another, a prison of his own making. Perhaps, in time, he might find the key to unlock it, but for now, he was condemned to carry the weight of his past, a silent penance for a single, devastating mistake. The truth was out, the secrets revealed, but the scars remained, etched deep within his soul. His exile had begun, a journey into the unknown, a search for a redemption that might forever elude him. The lighthouse stood defiant against the horizon, its light a beacon of hope and a monument to despair. The sea whispers secrets, the wind carries tales, and the lighthouse keeps watch. But who will watch over him now as he sails into the vast, unforgiving ocean of his future? What solace will he find in a world that knows his shame? What peace can he make in a life lived under the weight of a mistake? Will he ever truly know the freedom of the sea, or is he forever chained to the memory of a storm-tossed night? And in the quiet solitude of her watch, Isla knew the island held not only the secrets of the sea, but the weight of his unspoken story, and that she was now its keeper, the sole guardian of his past. The sea was in her now, the island was in her blood, and she knew, somehow, that their stories were far from over.